Over 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire had spread itself across at least the world known to those who lived in what is now Europe and the Middle East. The Roman Empire was an imperial, pre-industrial agricultural system of domination. It had a two-class system where the ruling class, 1 to 2% of the population, was wealthy and powerful, while 99% of the population was just surviving. The primary source of wealth at this point in time was agriculture. The ruling class gained more wealth and power through increasing agricultural production from their own people, or by acquiring and conquering lands to produce more agriculture, using the labor of the people living on those lands. Over time, the ruling class extracted more and more wealth through excessive taxes on agricultural production, ownership of the land, tenant farmer proper arrangements, and indentured and enslaved labor. Because the ruling class was skilled at extracting just the right amount of wealth from the population, the vast majority of people lived at subsistence levels, but were not starving nor driven to rebellion. The people of the peasant class were the agricultural workers and day laborers. Some may have owned small plots of land, but they were at risk of losing their plot if ever there was a low harvest or they went into debt. The peasant class also included manual workers, fishermen, construction workers, and artisans. They had no voice or power to shape the society, and neither did the people who were considered below the peasant class. These people were people without homes, people who needed to beg for food, people who were blind or physically disabled, and people who were considered unclean and untouchable. The majority of the population lived in small villages. Cities where the wealthy and powerful lived were primarily for governance. This was the milieu into which Jesus was born. Jesus was born under the rulership of Herod the Great or Herod the Benevolent, depending upon who you speak with. When Herod died a few years later, the Jewish people rose up and rebelled in opposition to Rome's rule. Not wanting to lose its land at the end of the Mediterranean Sea, the empire sent in troops and reconquered the homeland of the Jewish people, the nations of Galilee, Judea, Samaria, and the surrounding countryside. Jesus of Nazareth was a toddler when Rome placed Herod's son in Galilee and appointed longtime temple authorities and priests in Jerusalem to rule and maintain domestic order. Throughout Jesus' life, the Jewish people, responding to the effects of injustice and oppression, would protest and resist the empire. In turn, the Roman Empire would send in authorities to counteract the uprisings, which would eventually lead to a full-blown revolt, which would turn back around to strict Roman control in order to maintain domestic order. And then it would begin again, with the anger of living under injustice and oppression. As the story is told, Jesus was a carpenter, a trade he learned from his father Joseph. The family lived in Nazareth, a tiny village about an hour's walk from the capital city of Galilee. It is possible that Joseph and his sons worked on some of the massive building projects that were underway in the capital. Jesus grew up in a Jewish family in a Jewish village, learning the practices and ways of being Jewish throughout daily life. He learned his community's traditions, rituals, stories, scripture readings, prayers, and practices through regular participation, in the same way that any of us learn to be citizens in our societies and participants in our religious faiths. According to the stories, Jesus visited Jerusalem for the first time when he was 12 years old. There, he visited the temple with his parents. He asked questions of the temple priests who were impressed with this smart young man. Jesus did not visit Jerusalem again until his fateful visit on what has become known as Palm Sunday and the beginning of the Most Holy Week in Christian tradition, 20 or so years later. He did not visit until long after he had witnessed decades of exploitation and oppression of his people, long after he had already been speaking out against the domination of the Roman Empire. According to interpretations by theologian Marcus Borg, and Jesus was a known resistor with a fairly substantial following. He planned his return to Jerusalem carefully. Jesus arrived in Jerusalem on Sunday with thousands of other pilgrims to visit the temple for Passover. But before entering the city, he asked one of his friends to go into a nearby village to borrow a donkey. His plan to enter Jerusalem on a donkey was a direct reference to the Hebrew scriptures, where it said that a humble king would enter the city on the colt of a donkey. He would be a king of peace who would banish war horses and chariots and bring peace to all the land. Jesus was communicating to the people that he was there to speak of a peaceful kingdom. At the same time that Jesus was entering Jerusalem, the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, was arriving with an army and foot soldiers on the other side of the city. Every year, the population of Jerusalem grew from about 50,000 to 200,000. Pilgrims from all over gathered at the temple to celebrate Passover. Pilate and his army came to remind the people that Rome was in charge. The Jewish people could celebrate the ancient victory against Egypt, but they were warned not to resist the Roman Empire. Imagine the scene, writes Marcus Borg, as Pilate's procession entered the city, a parade of imperial power, weapons, helmets, golden eagles mounted on poles, sun glinting on metal and gold, the pounding of horse hooves, the clinking of bridles, the marching of feet, the creaking of leather, the beating of drums, the swirling of dust, the eyes of silent onlookers, some curious, some awed, some resentful. And then imagine Jesus entering on the back of a donkey, arriving like the King of Peace right out of the prophetic scriptures. No weapons, no threat, just a promise. Jesus offered an alternative option for life on earth, one of peace, rather than the existing imperial domination. Jesus planned his entrance as a political demonstration, a counter-demonstration to Pontius Pilate. Jesus was performing a form of symbolic street theater. Ancient street theater was a commonly used tactic to draw a crowd and then convey a message. The next day, Jesus visited the temple. The Gospel of Mark tells it like this: "And then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. He would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, 'It is not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer. Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers.'" The court of the temple was a huge space of about 24 acres, about half the size of both the parks here in Oneonta. Marcus Borg proposes that Jesus and his followers flipped over a few tables to create a small disruption and then use the ensuing confusion to teach. Street theater, again. A tactic to draw attention and then convey a message. If Jesus had taken over the entire courtyard, the temple authorities would have intervened and ended the demonstration. Instead, from a distance, it looked like a small disruption that cleared up as soon as Jesus had shared his message. Jesus accused the wealthy temple authorities and priests of collaborating with the Roman Empire. He accused the temple of becoming a center of oppression rather than a holy and sacred place. This statement was strong enough to get him in trouble with the temple authorities, but they were hesitant to arrest him immediately because they could see that he had a large following of people who agreed with him. Over the coming days, they engaged Jesus in various public debates in an effort to discredit him. However, on Thursday, Jesus shares a last meal with his friends, after which they visit a garden. And there, Jesus is arrested by the temple authorities. There are inconsistent stories about a trial that evening, but we do know that Jesus was found guilty. In the morning, he was beaten, shamed by being dressed up as a king in purple with a crown of thorns on his head. He was spit upon, stripped, and taken out to be executed. Jesus was crucified with two others. In English translations, these two men were called bandits, but the Greek word that was used is the term for those who engaged in armed resistance to Rome. In other words, terrorists or freedom fighters, depending on which side you were on. In the Roman Empire, the brutal and very public crucifixion was reserved for chronically defiant enslaved people and others who challenged Roman rule. Both refused to accept the established authority. This was state-sponsored terrorism, torture, and death as deterrent. Jesus was executed by the Roman Empire as a creative, radical anti-oppression organizer and justice activist. He was a revolutionary, someone to be inspired by, take leadership from. In every age, said Anne Braden, a longtime white Southern anti-racist organizer, no matter how cruel the oppression carried on by those in power, there have been those who struggled for a different world. I believe this is the genius of humankind, the thing that makes us half divine, the fact that some human beings can envision a world that has never existed. Braden continues, perhaps no one living today will see a major change, but it will come. And living in this time that is working to make it happen lets us know that our lives are worthwhile. The work of flipping over the tables of oppression began long before Jesus was born and has continued since his execution. The struggle for a different and better world has been fought by people with names we know well and those lost to history. People like Ella Baker, Gandhi, Lucy Stone, and Dorothea Dix. Resistors like Patrick Pierce, Dragging Canoe, William Wallace, and Malcolm X. Changemakers like Leonard Peltier, Nelson Mandela, Marsha P. Johnson, and Yuri Kochiyama. Let us not forget Carol Bartlett Crane, Cesar Chavez, and the many evolving leaders of the Black Lives Matter movements of today. These trans and cisgender Black, Indigenous people of color and white people and so many others know that liberation for all people and the creation of the beloved community on earth is possible through sustained efforts to dismantle systems of oppression. This was true in Jesus' day, it is true today, and it will be true into the future. Will you join the long stream of people who can envision a better world that has never existed?